So I'll just quickly talk through this. It's just I published a blog late last week, just with our thoughts around tactical urbanism. And realistically, I think a lot of the sort of content I wrote builds on what other people have published, starting with the LCC and then obviously other notes from Phil Jones Associates and others, Living Streets and stuff. Everyone's sort of putting their thinking forwards. I think what I've done a little bit differently has been sort of looking beyond just lockdown and sort of as the situation evolves. So you'll see at the bottom here, there's a link to the actual blog post I wrote. If you want to see it, it should be quite easy to find on the Sustrans website. And here on the cover page, you'll see the sort of the Barnes project that I think a lot of us seen. I think Raphael is actually attending today to sort of help set it up. And the picture below shows just, I guess, the view of the same street in Street View. And I think for me, it's important to think about what that space was before, but especially what it could be in the future as sort of lockdown loosens, the kind of what could that street look like and what does that mean for people who still need to go about their essential trips. So as a lot of us have said, right now, the pressing need for local authorities and for people that are sort of in the industry is to ensure the safety of those undertaking essential trips. And obviously you'll see the two pictures here I took at the weekend, obviously footways that are way too narrow to allow sort of socially distanced walking, and people who are sort of new to cycling, but the roads are still not safe enough for them to cycle on the carriageway. And so the obvious sort of discussions that a lot of people have been having around sort of widening footways and looking at maybe sort of filtering streets. So this is the answer. So I've got just a couple of pictures of what's been done so far. I've got the picture on the top left from Dublin, where they've obviously used some sort of Wandorkers, some of the ReadyWell products to widen the footways. And on the right, the picture from Mark from Brighton, where they've sort of closed that section of public highway. So this is a sort of, hopefully everyone's sort of aware of these and sort of knows about this, but I think it's more important when we start looking forward a little bit. And I think it's important to discuss some of the tools, and I think there's a lot of discussions, particularly within local authorities now, about what kind of powers they have to deliver this kind of change. And I think it's useful to think about it with sort of other extreme events that we've been through. So I think terrorism was a very interesting one in London. Obviously, we had loads of barriers go up almost overnight. That actually stayed up for quite some time. Actually, these on Westminster are still there, sort of 4 years on. But now we seem to be reticent to putting any kind of barrier up if it doesn't have to do with sort of construction. And you look at the sort of even just the impact of the number of people affected by a terrorist attack versus coronavirus, and it's quite incomparable. On the right, you look at the sort of the DFT, the TRO for the Brighton scheme. There was actually, I think there's been a bit of confusion about the DFT letter. A lot of people sort of over enthusiastically, I think, thinking that they can do what they want. I think Dan Bowman today on Twitter rightly pointed out the only real change has been that they don't need to advertise in a local newspaper. But I think the surrounding comms are basically saying, local authorities do have all the powers it takes to implement these emergency traffic orders. And the fact that you don't need to advertise in local newspapers just means you can basically do it almost overnight. I think important to think about the relationship between the emergency and the emerging scenario, particularly as life after lockdown evolves or as lockdown loosens. And I think there is a bit of a danger of just getting on and doing things. So we saw some shout outs sort of on Twitter asking for people, what streets should we filter? And I think there is a bit of a risk of losing track of the bigger picture. And that sort of this kind of approach leads to a few vocal people improving their own area rather than looking at the bigger picture of, what are we trying to achieve in terms of impact at a city or country scale. So we've seen some different approaches, particularly in the States, in Denver, which has sort of been data driven. When you look at, what streets should we filter, they looked at deprivation, they looked at density, they looked at access to green space, and tended to prioritize areas where that is, where there's already injustice around that, rather than trying to filter streets that already maybe are very close to green spaces or have higher levels of socioeconomic status. And the other question I think for me is, how do we ensure that we bring people along this journey? Obviously, it's really difficult to engage right now, but we do need to get buy-in from people if we want to translate these temporary filters into permanent filters. We don't want these filters just to be associated with, this was something we did during lockdown. We want it to be something that can be, extended beyond that. And so I think trying to engage people through online tools or through letter drops, through FAQs, through site banners, I think just the number of banners that have been put up in parks around social distancing, it shows the power of getting messages out there. I think we could be doing something more in terms of creating an information campaign about the importance of public space that has been sort of really highlighted during the pandemic. And yeah, so the point at the bottom about linking any change to the greater societal challenge. So whenever you're thinking about doing something, just think, how can this contribute to climate emergency? How can this contribute to inequality and obesity? And it becomes really important, I think, as we look ahead to the loosening of lockdown. I think it's undeniable that all of us will change our travel patterns. Even us, who are sort of, a lot of us will already be doing lots of walking and cycling. But the data from Wuhan, this is a perception survey that was done by Ipsos, that looks at sort of the increased appeal of travel by private car as lockdown loosens. And I think we can all sort of understand that, particularly as public transport makes it very difficult to travel while social distancing. A lot of people will be drawn to the car, and they think it's the responsibility of local authorities to ensure that that doesn't result in everyone just going to either the car or, you know, if they can afford it, going to Ubers as the default mode of transport. So I think this kind of narrative can be very powerful in sort of pushing local authorities away from just sort of a passive attitude of, oh, well, let's wait for things to go back to normal, because things won't go back to normal. There'll be a sort of potentially permanent change in the way people move, and both how often and by which mode of transport they move. And I think this is also a little bit linked to the idea of modeling. I think probably most of us in the room here have had issues with modeling in the past. It's scuppered some of our schemes. If there was ever a time to prove that modeling is not predictive of the future, that's right now. I think, you know, no model predicted the arrival of a pandemic that meant no one would travel anywhere. So I think any sort of scheme that you've had that's been scuppered by modeling, right now is the opportunity to question, you know, is that modeling what should be getting in the way of progress? The last point I'm going to touch on is just a few questions, I think, prompting questions on what the best way forward is, particularly as lockdown loosens. On the left, you'll see touching on filtering streets. So I think it's important as professionals that we think about what is the role of a filtered street. And I think right now during lockdown, it's very much the idea of creating public space and reducing pressure on green spaces. But as we move towards the loosening of lockdown, I think it's going to be increasingly about preventing that mode shift towards car travel. So it's going to be more about the low traffic neighborhoods approach that can guarantee that mode shift and that evaporation of traffic. I think Oakland, for example, has sort of made a street every 10 access only, but when people return to sort of something more normal in terms of travel patterns, that's not going to discourage people from using their cars for their local trips. If you do a low traffic neighborhood approach that looks at a whole cell holistically and makes those driven trips harder, then you will get that mode shift, you will get that evaporation, and your system will be more resilient and more equitable for your local residents. And the second one, I think, is this sort of emergency bike lanes, which no one, I think, has quite cracked yet. I think Germany have got a guide, but they're still some way away from it. I think Italy are now almost getting there. They've had some commitment from some local authorities. But I think it's really important to think when we look at this about using it as an opportunity to build infrastructure that you're already planning on doing. I think it's important not to lose track of the strategic links that we're looking to build. So I think really pushing those schemes that were already, for example, in London, highlighted in the strategic cycling analysis. And I've sort of, the provocative is modeling dead. I think there's a lot of sort of cycling scheme that went in sort of in the deep end because of modeling, and now modeling is kind of, you know, whatever data you've ever collected will not be representative of conditions for the next 6, 8, 10, 12 months at least. So I think it's an opportunity to redefine what sort of the base model shows. And the last question is one for the engineers in the room, and it's about the safety at junctions. I think it's something we still haven't quite cracked. I think we can easily, you know, build a bike lane like the one in the picture in probably, you know, 10, 15 days. But what do we do at junctions? How do we guarantee that a cyclist, particularly novice cyclists that have just discovered cycling as a mode of transport, are safe going through the junctions without sort of low traffic cycle signals or sort of harder to implement measures? So that's it from me. These are kind of my thoughts, and happy to have people's comments or conversations. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, Giulio. There was before I open it up to everybody, there's a couple of observations I made. So we started off saying data's everything, but then modelling was dead. Just to make that distinction between like the sort of transport planning, where people live, what they earn, what they're doing, is still really important in there. But yeah, you're absolutely right. We won't be able to do traditional modelling for who knows, a couple of years. What is normal now? What is your base condition? What's your future base in there? It does throw a lot of things into the question. A lot of these things that have been perhaps holding us back from reallocating space for years. So,
do you see any opportunity or any need for, like, to date it seems like all these changes are basically rely on individual connections in individual councils and individuals kind of getting it, and obviously I know in Greater Manchester there's moves to kind of, you know, at a higher level to try and get this kind of strategic oversight, but is that kind of happening as well? Is there any opportunity, or is there any way that, you know, this can become more powerful rather than it as it's been today, always relying on, you know, individual councils having a highways officer who gets it?
I don't think there's an easy solution. I think it's one of those where everyone's got to push, and every local authority is going to be more or less receptive to it. I do think it's the kind of thing that snowballs, that it takes a few really hard grafted ones, and then once other local authorities see it's possible, then they might pick it up. I also think it is important to highlight the dangers, and the more data we have that points towards a huge increase in car travel is really a good way to sort of, you know, feel the fire under officers or under councillors' seats, because so far it all feels very unthreatening. Everyone just sees these empty streets and people walking and cycling, and it's lovely. And the worst thing that's going to happen is we're going to go back to normal. But I think the point that it's not going to go back to normal hasn't quite clicked for a lot of people.
Yeah, I'll just add as well that Sustrans are a national organisation, so there's usually someone from Sustrans you can grab in your local area. At least they're offering to help on this one. So we have got some national organisations involved in it, and obviously Living Streets have been into lots of stuff as well, and London Cycling Campaign, I know are not national, but a lot of people look to them. They put some good stuff out there.
Just you mentioned, Brian, Living Streets. Are you actually working with them? So it's a joint enterprise. Hounslow have responded that we need to do a petition if we want any roads closed, and we have to suggest the roads that we want, which is really not the way to go, because obviously there's always going to be the vested interests of the car drivers against that. And I brought this up last week, and we have a very pro-cycling MP and a pretty good council, but it takes far too long. Any thoughts?
It does seem, I think at a high level through the Cycling Coalition, we've been doing work with organizations that are part of that, through Walking and Cycling Coalition. I think translating that sort of high level agreement to local action, I think takes a lot of work. And I think, yeah, it's up to everyone, I think, to try to establish those links. I mean, at Sustrans, we are very fortunate. We do work across all boroughs, and that's something we're trying to leverage and sort of trying to have a consistent approach to all boroughs, because, you know, as a lot of people have highlighted, often it is up to just how vocal people are, and that doesn't necessarily translate into an equitable change. You know, we want to make sure that sort of people across London get the benefits of that could potentially come out of the pandemic. But I do think, yeah, working across groups can be very powerful in terms of trying to push for that change.
So we've all got to push and like coordinate on the fly here. But like all the stuff that we've been talking about for the past 20 years for some of us, longer for others on this, it's all working now, and there's a reason that we've been asking for it. So it's getting that message out there that's important.
In Hackney, the councillor for transport, John Burke, did approach both LCC and Living Streets to suggest streets. And he was asked, as Giulio said, you know, whether there was going to be a data-based approach rather than just Living Streets and the LCC choosing particular streets. In fact, we did respond, and we tried to make it as wide as possible, our selection of streets, but we based the selection on principles, you know, that streets, these sorts of streets should be open, the ones that give access to local high streets, streets that make it easier to cross over to parks, or streets that make it easier to get over to the high street. So we based our suggestions on principles rather than just using specific names of streets. So we did give many examples such as. So it was a sort of a combination of your approach, Julia, of having a data-based, evidence-based approach rather than preferences. Because preferences you get, people will always name their own street. If you ask people which street shall we close, or which street shall we, filter, they'll say our own street. So, but Hackney has tried, but we don't know. Nothing's happened yet. So we're still waiting. I don't know if John Burke is actually on this talk, but it would be great to see a result at some stage. Thanks.
I know that Hackney are working on it. I've been talking to some of the officers in there, so we're hoping Hackney as ever lead the way on this.
I was on another Zoom call with some people from New Zealand last week, and somebody was talking about the same sort of thing, about how do we measure this, how do we find the places that people are going to be wanting to put comments down. And they're saying, well, it was almost like there's this patchwork of different authorities doing it in different ways, and it'd be fantastic if the likes of Sustrans or work with Living Streets to create something that asks the same questions consistently across the country, so that it's not, Shoreham Cycle Campaign have put their, little survey on, somebody else has done it in a different way. And so that we end up with an amazing data set that could be then put back to not only your own local authorities, but to the DFT to start really showing how there's a consistent voice across the country. And it isn't just the places with the keen transport planning officers or the good campaigns. It could be everywhere. So I think I'd like to see some of those national organisations really taking up this opportunity. And there are great survey tools out there that have been used by some of the London boroughs in the living neighbourhood stuff, and they're there and could be scaled up and have been used already.
Well, one of the things Giulio mentioned was about the messaging and making sure it's the right thing. I mean, I've been telling people that just talk about emergency, but I'm going to introduce Steve Connor now, who's kindly hosting this event in there. And here's a man who knows how to message things. He runs a company called Creative Concerns, and whenever I've struggled communicating anything to the people of Manchester in my gruff way, I ask Steve for the right words. So I'm gonna pass over to Steve now, who's going to talk us a little bit about a plan for Manchester City Centre. Steve, the floor is yours.
Brilliant, thanks, Brian. I'm about to do the equivalent of there's two presentation cock-ups that I really hate. The one we've all seen it is when people apologise for their presentation just before they deliver it. And then they usually apologise at the end as well, just to make it doubly horrible. The other thing you can do that's really stupid is to hand out a leaflet just before you present, so that everybody's leafing through it. I'm about to do the digital equivalent of that and send you in the chat room a link to the vision that I'm about to talk about. So I've basically just told you all to go and browse the internet rather than listen to me. Which is a disaster, but there you go. No, very briefly, thanks, Brian. Lovely to see you all. Hang on, I'm admitting people into the room while I'm doing this, so excuse me if I'm a bit distracted. I was very briefly going to take you through a shared vision for Manchester City Centre that we crafted literally just weeks, if not days before lockdown, achieved pretty much the same thing that we were visioning, actually, which is we'd had a load of chats on Twitter and various other fora about getting cars out of the city in a much more rigorous and wholesale way. And so I invited a reasonably varied group. I wouldn't pass any huge diversity test, but residents, designers, urbanists, planners, to a workshop where we worked together, activists as well, we worked together to craft a vision of a car-free city centre. And I just thought I'd outline the key points of that for you all in the next sort of 5 minutes, and then you can plug away. We've got several people who helped craft the vision are on this call. So this is not my creation, it's something that's shared across quite a few people who are on this call. So they can probably pick up questions as well. Where we started with was the idea that certainly our city centre in Manchester, for those of you who don't know it, which is shameful and you should visit as soon as you can, but is intensely walkable. and navigable. And so we started with this idea of a 10-minute city, which you'll have seen other cities globally coming up with this sort of framing for their pitch. But we realised that from each of the main public transport nodes and from the inner ring road, everything you could reach was about 10 minutes away. We realised that we were being a bit too speedy in this vision, so we've enlarged it to 20-minute city, just so people take a bit more time, chill out, don't rush quite so much. And also we realised that the 10-minute city had been particularly urged by Chris Boardman in the meeting, who's a bit of a speed freak. So we just slowed everything down a little bit. And what we got to in our vision was the idea, obviously, as you will all embrace wholeheartedly, is a city centre where the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. So a minority of people travel into our city centre by car anyway. So we're catering for the majority. And where we got to in our vision was pretty much the idea that because people spend money and not cars, the economic imperative is not necessarily to keep traffic flowing through the city centre. And then we got into an even more interesting part of the conversation, which you'll find on the blog that I've shared with you, which is where we started to talk about the city as a park, and whether we could actually reclaim the 8% of the city that's currently parking, and the rest of it that we devote to allowing traffic to go through, and whether we could create a more playful, meaningful, navigable space. And this is the point in our workshop and our follow-up conversations where it got really interesting, because even though the majority of us in the workshop were very bike focused, I think it's fair to say, Brian, nod if you agree, we ended up talking about walking the whole way through. And I know I was not the only one in there that started to almost in my head dismount off my Brompton and imagine sort of walking through the city instead of cycling through it in this sort of future that we were visioneering. So we got to this idea of a city as a park. We realised that recently, in common with a number of different urban centres, we'd actually started to create those spaces anyway. So there's some bits of space in the city centre where this is already played out, so people can see how this might look. And we realised that underpinning all of this would be climate emergency and no way to achieve. We've got a net zero goal of 2038, a science-based target. This is the trajectory we need to go on anyway, so it will need to happen. And then I would say in our workshop, we got into some really interesting conversations around deliveries, practical sort of navigating the space for people who've got special needs of some sort of permitting system. If you absolutely desperately needed to pick up something extraordinarily large and lug it into your boot, there'd be a mechanism to get through that. And then obviously for residents in the city centre, how do we deal with those who have car-based needs? But essentially this is our car-free city centre vision, and you can all have a read of it. In terms of tackling the tricky questions that people came up with, and we have one local councillor who was really good sort of sounding post, and she's still not terribly convinced actually. But where we got to in terms of people unpicking the vision, from my perspective, every single argument around people with disabilities, people with special needs, people in food and beverage sector leaving jobs late at night, every argument I heard was an argument for better public transport rather than the unfettered use of cars right across the city centre. So the vision I've shared with you, so you can have a look, and would welcome all of your feedback to it. The next stage in this process with the sort of collective that we've put together is that we're going to do some hacking of the city. We're going to look at, with Brian and others, what would our redesign of this sort of unfettered and decluttered city look like, and how could we be more playful and come up with some inspiring ideas so that we haven't just got this sort of car-free vision and a set of Q&As about it, but some exciting ideas of a city reinvented once we've managed that liberation. And so that's where we're hoping to get to in the very near future, perhaps using some sort of online software tools so that we can actually do a full-on hackathon. So that's our 20-minute city, coming to a city near you. And the only thing I would say to finish off is events have overtaken us. And so really pleasingly, we've had stories breaking over the weekend about people, calling into question whether we do want cars to come back in once lockdown has eased. And so, given the conversations we've already had with Giulio's help, I think our vision, the direction of travel for politics in the city, potentially is in our favour. Right, that's me done, Brian.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Steve. I'll open it up again. Has anybody got any questions for Steve? I've certainly got lots of questions for him, but I'm trying to give him answers as well as a general rule. Does anybody want to unmute themselves and ask a quick question?
Yeah, I'm interested in playful. I wonder if you could expand a little bit on some of the thoughts about how you make the place more playful.
Sure. I mean, and my co-authors can come in on this, but we had a really brilliant, that part of the conversation was kicked off by a really brilliant landscape architect. And we thought about basically trees, not cars, parks, not parking, and how if we did liberate space, we could certainly see a boost for green infrastructure at the very least. But then also thinking about innovative different routes across the city. Could we do something really interesting? We've got some lovely industrial architecture in the core of the city, which is not terribly utilised. So could that become a bit of urban space that people use to sort of walk around in different ways? So we started to think about that. And the classic stuff around design and city where movement is something that people choose because it's fun rather than utilitarian. And that playing into something around health and well-being and getting physical activity levels up as well. So that's the essence of the conversation, really. I would say at its heart, though, it was definitely the sort of city as park idea. How could we redesign this space if we liberated so much space?
Yeah, Steve talked about the hackathon idea, and I want to introduce Peter Biczok, who works for a company called Remix, because frankly, if we were going to redesign our cities and our city centres quickly during the emergency, you give it to a CAD engineer like me, you'll be waiting most of the day for the first 500 metres of it. There might be a quicker way, and I'm hoping Peter's on the call, and he'll now talk to us about Remix. Peter, are you there?
Remix is an online-based company, which certainly makes things easier these days. We are already in 350 companies or agencies across the US, and also in Europe, a few councils. We are actually just signed a contract back in January with Southern Council as well. So if I would see so we're also in the UK. There are essentially three bigger products. One deals with public transport and how to make it more efficient and how to bring in fast plans for public transport. What I'm going to be speaking about is actually the streets product, which is, I think, very, very interesting, especially in these times when we want to bring in quick changes to our infrastructure and to visualize and communicate these changes to more people. As it's all, of course, database, so we are integrating all GIS or whatever information you have into one platform, which also makes it easier for the planners to use these. So you don't have to be a GIS expert to plan something, but you have the easy tools to visualize it. Probably just jump in rather to the tool itself. Let me just jump out here. You can also, of course, find us online and see how it works. I will probably just jump into a new area.
Brilliant. Yeah. So thanks for that, Peter. I'm going to open it to questions, but just to summarise, it was working slow from the lag from Budapest, but that was as quick as I've ever seen a drawing done. The fact that you was doing a couple of kilometres in an afternoon, doing whole networks in a day, that's the kind of speediness, and it's at a pretty reasonable level, and it's all collaborative. You can instantly share. I'm hoping lots of the planners on the call today will see the implications of that and how exciting it could be. So maybe that's something that we could look at using for the hackathon in Manchester.
Phil from Tunbridge Wells, thanks for that presentation. It looks like a fabulous product. I've been using StreetMix to just engage our local authority councillors and officers in what we can do in terms of street design. Is this product available free like street mixes for campaign groups like ourselves?
No, our main target's actually municipalities. And so if the municipality would be, so it's a subscription-based model. If the municipality would, have the budget for it, then of course they would have as many accounts as they want. So they can also share it with the advocacy groups as well. If you have only one project where you would have like a consultancy doing some works for you, then it's certainly so much more competitive to do it in-house on your own and much faster and less work hours spent.
Okay, so the best thing to do, if you can, is to look at www.rdrf.org.uk, the Road Danger Reduction Forum website. I did a post before this chat last week, which got a kind of record number of views. Lots of people are interested. Got a lovely review of it from Professor Phil Goodwin. Thanks, Phil, if you're listening. And I've updated it last night. Now, so that's the good news. And the good news is that Mark Strong of this parish has got Madeira Drive as an open street. That's very good. And frankly, the rest of it is bad news. I mean, I'm sorry to pour cold water on things, but the situation at the moment is pretty shit. It really is quite dire. You know, I know it's a nice sunny day, but we really do have to be aware of the fact this is a critical time for us. We're not going to get this opportunity again. And now, 4 weeks into lockdown, we're getting more or less nothing. The official stuff is odd bits and pieces. There's a seafront in Portsmouth, Birkenhead Tunnel being opened up a bit. There's a road to a park in Cardiff, and one or two odd bits and pieces like that have been done, but the overall picture is bad. Now, what's happened is that earlier on somebody said, let's all work together. What are the organizations doing? And Sustrans, Living Streets, Cycling UK, British Cycling, along with an NHS trust under the aegis of Brompton Cycles, wrote to the minister and said, we do need clear support for getting the necessary measures in. And what happened is that there's been new guidance on traffic regulations during COVID that was reissued again yesterday or today, and broadly speaking it's saying the same thing. In other words, more or less nothing. The comments made on it by Professor John Parkin and Trevor Durante Highwayman are saying, sorry, this just isn't good enough. It's basically about changing the needs for certain kinds of notification, but the system is still the same. And as a consequence, there isn't much happening. I know Chris Boardman wants to do stuff, but there is a big logjam. There is a problem, whether it be with local authorities, their officers, councillors, local groups, or whatever. There isn't really anything happening. What has happened is there's been a bit of guerrilla stuff. There was some DIY stuff done in Bristol that was taken out by the council. There's been some guerrilla stuff done in Richmond, which is really just kind of small footway extensions. Council hasn't been involved. The kind of wide level, large scale filtered permeability, temporary bike lanes, footway extensions, shopping streets, an idea put out by London's Living Streets, carriageway narrowings needed to reduce speeding. That hasn't been happening. There's one council in London that I know of where some of the officers are trying hard. They're thinking of some temporary bike lanes, rather limited length, to protect NHS workers going to hospital. They will be protected by water-filled barriers as well as cones. Cones aren't really good enough. Some perhaps temporary plant lock type mini planters. You can't put in wands because they need to be drilled in, wouldn't be temporary. So that's the kind of stuff they're thinking about. They are thinking about it, but 4 weeks into lockdown, that's really all we've got. And my understanding about Hackney, with a lot of push from Councillor Burke, is they're thinking in terms of what's there in the existing programme. So in terms of getting stuff now, before we start talking about what kind of alternative to modelling and what kind of data and blah, 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 we have to realise that we're in a pretty bad situation. We're not getting the push. My understanding is that this week the Commissioner will be making some kind of announcement. Do watch out for that very carefully. If there isn't, we're really going to have to ramp things up in terms of some serious political campaigning, because it's not good enough. Okay, a couple of brief things. Policing's still going on, done well in London to deal with ultra speeders. If you're on social media, do say thank you to the police when they're doing something good. Thanks to all the updates I'm getting from people like Danny Williams. Do look at Mike Lydon's spreadsheet from America on what's happening, developments around the world. Other countries, of course, are better than ours. France has got a number of municipalities thinking about it. Berlin, as you know, has got guidelines and is cracking on with temporary bike lanes. Vienna, Budapest, and so on. But it's still not that brilliant across the world as a whole, and it certainly isn't in London, in Britain as a whole. So, you know, we are really in not a good position. We need to keep in touch with each other about how to work through the various campaigning organizations. There will be stuff to do with DIY and whatever it is, but it needs to be pressure on the politicians as to why they are not going ahead with things. Do examine all the relevant documents. Stuff like key workers can be cycle instructors, can be the traffic management engineers. Some contractors are actually doing works, they're there, stuff can be done. And, you know, frankly, I'm pretty furious. I know I'm a bit of an angry man at the best of times, but at the moment I'm pretty furious that stuff isn't happening anything like as much as it should. Anyway, watch this space, go to the RDRF website, follow us on Twitter, and I shall be carrying on with my updates, and I hope I will be here next week with lots of nice stuff to report. But unfortunately, the only nice stuff is that we've got nearly 100 dead keen people on this Zoom thing. A couple of thousand people plus have been reading our stuff on RDRF. So we're out there, but it isn't happening yet.
Thanks, Bob. So I hope that's raised all our spirits during this testing time. But it's so true that there's so much needs to happen in there. And what I keep telling people is that silence from the public sector usually means that they're doing something, but they're too frightened to say because of the messaging. And I'm hope we've covered that a little bit tonight in there. But I'm just going to invite a couple of questions because I want to get to the good news, which is what Mark Strong's been up to in Brighton in there. So has anybody got any questions or comments on Bob? I think, Andy, you had something to say.
And it's not normal business. You know, it is down to chief executives are making decisions based on what they believe they need to be doing and also what they're being told to do. And the politicians aren't actually in the driving seat of some of this. I think it's also about trying to just make sure that we've got the what can we do immediately? It is about social distancing. It's about, you know, what's going to press people's buttons. The mailbags are full of people complaining about cycles whizzing past them on the pavements or close to them. Actually, that's about, you know, how do we create these cycle lanes? But the modelling and those sort of things are brilliant for the longer term. But for the what do we do that's going to actually make a difference while we're in lockdown it's got to be some, let's just get some stuff there. Let's look at the supermarkets and pharmacies and places, for the very localized stuff. And I'm really hopeful. I've got cabinet tomorrow, and I'm really hopeful I'm going to get something out of BCP. But I can't announce it yet because I haven't actually got it. But I've been prodding in every direction I can to make it happen.
And that's the message I've been getting of a lot of the councillors that I speak to. They're really pushing the waiting. It's a timing thing where, we're getting past peak and people are looking at how we get out of this thing and how do we do it in a reasonable way now. So that's really positive.
Well, I was just agreeing with you, Brian, that I think councils have been dealing with kind of emergency priorities, dealing with getting people fed and understanding, restructuring themselves to some degree. And I hope that the time will come where they'll start looking more closely at this stuff.
The best thing that has happened has been what Mark's done. Chapeau to him. Shouldn't have needed a volunteer professional, but he was there, he was on the case, and that really, there's an argument about whether the first thing was a South Sea parade, but that wasn't done for any kind of right reasons. It wasn't thought through. It was just an emergency thing done because too many people were congregating. So Mark will go down in history as having been involved in the first of the good moves. So well done to him.
That's what we did. I hesitate to take all the credit because I put pressure on them. It was obviously a decision by officers and members at the end of it all. I've got to disagree with Bob. It absolutely does need to take professional lobbying. The officers, as Andy said, are massively overstretched. They're essentially being completely redeployed to logistic support. They're running, the council staff have been pushed to the limit already, and now they're being told to go off and run a PPE supply unit or work out how to drive vulnerable people around. They just do not have the resources to do anything. There might be one person who's got half a day a week left to think about this. So it's unfair to blame them for not responding. They're so at the end of their tether, and they're being stretched. They're seeing people die. So really, you've got to praise the positives. Any attacks, any criticisms of councils at this moment will just completely rebound on us because they are really, at their limit. So all we can do is give them the reasons why they need to do things and make it easy for them to do things, which is basically what I did. I wrote a detailed letter to them, explained how it could be done, and just all they needed to do was say yes. And made it easy for them. And I think that's what we've got to do in these circumstances. They used the Road Traffic Regulation Act, Section 14. There is a clause in that somewhere, I can't get the picture up of the actual notice on the lamppost. There is a clause in that which says you can close the highways by notice if it's regarding public danger. Now, public danger is not defined. It doesn't really mention pandemics, which wasn't in the lawyers' legislation mind when they thought about it. It's really about cliffs falling down and buildings falling on roads. So the issue of people being infected wasn't really considered, but the issue of people walking and cycling already out there being put at risk by increased speeding traffic was considered to be, by the lawyers, considered to be suitable. So that's the grounds on which they did it. And they had to overcome the internal lawyers who are very, very reluctant, and they will be in every council, reluctant to use this. So you can use what's deemed as a temporary traffic order. The problem with that is it only lasts for 21 days, and that's what Brighton have done, so let's see what happens in 21 days. If you do an experimental traffic order, which is the other alternative, you have to have grounds for believing that you want to do this permanently. So that's sort of what Hackney are going to do. You can't invent something that you might have just thought about doing and then claim that you're going to want to do it in the long term, because that's not going to get past local authority lawyers. So, and there is the political risk, and this is what some people have been saying, the political risk of appearing to be taking advantage of the crisis, which yes, we do, but some politicians are wary of being seen to what they call, stealth improvements, a better word, being seen to be putting in stuff to support the cycling lobby under the guise of doing things. And we might disagree with them, but that's the wariness at the political level. So we have to make it clear of things that we're doing that are temporary, that are supporting what's happening now, and things that are building on the long term, and make a very clear distinction between those two things. The one thing I would say actually is that I've written a blog piece for the CIHT, Chartered Institute of Highways and Transportation, and having it recognised, or at least on the page of a professional body, is quite important. And those of you who are members of ICE, CILT and so on might want to think about trying to get the same thing on their web pages, because then it's important. The final thing is about who somebody, I think, was it Ruth, said about the Transport Select Committee. Ruth Cadbury is strangely reluctant to take this up, and she's the chair of the All Party Cycling Group. So I don't quite know what's going on there, but she's very reluctant to sort of lobby about this. And I think that's partly, again, reluctance of the politicians to put themselves in the firing line as being seen to be taking advantage. So I think everything we do, I'm afraid, needs to be relently positive. We shouldn't be criticising. We should be criticising government, fine, but not local authorities and not local politicians, because they just will turn off. If we do that, they'll just turn off. And I saw other people saying no marches, no demonstrations. We'll just get slated. If we start doing critical mass, which some people in Extinction Rebellion were talking about doing, it will go down very badly. Now, other people might disagree with me, but I think we have to be constructive, professional, and positive as far as we can be for what we're going to do. And I'll leave it there.
I just want to say that there's been a lot of chat in the chat about, while I totally appreciate the previous point that, we need to be positive and councils are under immense pressure. I just don't feel there's enough being done to create a kind of really loud, noisy, clear and simple national campaign about what should be happening that would enable grassroots groups like mine to really get behind and make it clear what should be done. I mean, I know it's going to be different for each community, but there's been a lot of chat about that, and I'm wondering if maybe next week's session could be really focused on doing that. There's been ideas for letters and all sorts of things, but even if we need to agree, hashtag, there's all sorts of things we need to do, and maybe we can make that the focus for next week.
Well, that sounds like a pretty good plan to me. Basically, as great ideas come in, we're just front loading them. But to talk more specifically about campaigning and activism sounds like a pretty good idea. So, I'll take it on board, and we'll try and sort that out for next week.
I was just going to say, I think Giulio's presentation from earlier and the Wuhan data is the clear way forward. It's the thing that absolutely everyone has to keep now saying. And we've got to remember as well, I'm from LCC, so we're a regional org. We're doing a lot on this, but everyone in our office, everyone in Cycling UK, everyone in Living Streets, everyone in all the campaign orgs, we're all scrambling at the moment. It's all like, and it's a daily, if not hourly, kind of changing situation. So I think whatever data comes out, Milan doing what Milan are doing, every city that does something new, that helps make the case. And the Wuhan data makes the case. I think we're all trying to make the case. Something will emerge from the national orgs, I have no doubt, within the next few days.
What do people think in terms of, the wider public appetite for reallocation of road space? Because I hear it obviously a lot in urban design, in the world that we live in cycling activism, cycling and walking and active travel. I'm sure we all are seeing a lot of snarking about it's disgraceful that people aren't social distancing properly on footpaths, but I don't see the more mainstream people saying, and isn't it disgraceful that we can't walk on the roads? Do other people have a sense, and particularly the gentleman from the communications organization, sorry, I can't remember, is it Chris?
Steve, sorry, how did I get Chris? I'd be very interested in hear how you might suggest we frame it.
It is, well, certainly now, I mean, I've been thinking a lot, actually most of the time I've been working recently on framing climate change through the lens of coronavirus, actually, and that's really interesting once you start to think what it's like. With my glass half full, or my can of Brewdog half full, I'd say that anybody would be foolish right now to read public sentiment around major urban transitions, because we've just been through a massive global transition, probably on a scale which is similar to the one we need to achieve net zero carbon or not far away from it. And I think that makes it a really interesting moment in time for all of us who are discussing large-scale change. And so I wouldn't assume negativity or positivity, but I would assume flux. And I think that's really important. And I think everybody who, and a number of people have mentioned this, everybody who's heightened about playing a blame game or protesting or doing anything that could achieve backlash, I think it's right to be concerned about all of that. So in campaigning terms, I totally agree. We should lead with positivity, solutions, and alternative visions. In terms of negativity around walking and cycling, I don't think I've picked much of that up, but I definitely live in a very rarefied Twitter bubble at the moment. But I certainly haven't picked it up. And one thing I have seen, certainly from Manchester, in the mass media, and the Manchester Evening News, as our local paper, is not famed for huge amounts of progressive thought in this area. They've been writing about a different vision for our streetscapes coming out of all of this. So I think there is appetite there. But getting the framing right on it is really important, and avoiding a blame game in particular is crucial.
I got interviewed by the Brighton Evening Argus, which we call locally the Cargus, and Meridian TV, and it was amazingly positive. Both reports, both journalists were just not the usual snarky anti-cycling stuff that their outlets normally come up with, and that must be driven by people commenting to them, because that's how that's how they decide what to do. So local community groups that in Brighton, who normally are split, are just saying, this is wonderful, we can go down there, and they don't know who did it or why it was done or how it was done or whatever the background. They just say, hey, we can go down there. So people are reacting more positively.
Thanks everyone for being here. I'm Matthew Danish. I'm a trustee with CamCycle, and I just wanted to say, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. I think at this point we really need to just get stuff out there. And I heard earlier that junctions are a problem. Well, I know outside maybe TfL junctions are very complicated, but in many places actually I think the problem can be massively simplified. It's just about putting out the cones. You can adjust them afterwards, or the barriers, the water-filled barriers, whatever it is. Make things as simple as possible, and don't need to make it ideal. So don't go around saying though that junctions are too hard, because then they just won't do anything, and then we'll be stuck. So I think it's just we need to go rough and ready and just try and make things as simple as possible.
Yeah, there's a fan of my engineering style. I've certainly lived by those rules of rough and ready. Has anybody else got anything to share? I think that was a really good point, though.
In terms of framing, I totally echo. I mean, I've been involved in some emergency planning, but in education for the last few weeks, and I think we just have to reflect that people have been all hands on deck dealing with real emergencies, and we need to be very respectful of that. But I think the time has come now to make the case super clearly. I think the right hook, and that the Wuhan data is completely compelling. It makes a clear case that there is a moral imperative to create space for healthy ways of moving around our streets. And I think the hook, the difficult message, but the one that has to be delivered, and the right hook for it, is to say the reality is that as soon as lockdown eases, there is going to be a surge in demand for walking and cycling, because people are going to avoid public transport like the plague. And a rather cliched expression, but brings home to people the hard reality is, unless absolutely necessary, people are not wanting to get in crowded space. And I would say, focusing on walking for councils that don't get it, walking to me is always the right hook, and focusing on the high street to begin with. For councils that are willing to do something more, then the idea of low traffic neighbourhoods or healthy neighbourhoods, so maybe we use the moniker healthy streets because it seems to be so applicable here as the right hook.
Thank you. Just going back to the point about what the general public are thinking, we're really seeing, just with my Enfield hat on, that there's a group that have been living on a very, very highly polluted residential road that's been classified as a B road, and is basically a relief road for the North Circular. It goes past, sorry, it's my dog. It goes past Barings Green Station, 10,000 cars a day, illegal levels of pollution, and the residents have been in despair for years about this. And suddenly they're living on a low traffic street where they can breathe. People who have been suffering from depression are better. asthmatics are better, people are walking down the middle of the road. I mean, it's just amazing, and it's such a big hook to say we do not want to go back to where we were. And I think there are probably lots of examples out there of that. I mean, this is a really dramatic one, and I think there's a basis now for a campaign to say to everyone on that street in the area, let's not go back. You know, we want a bus gate on this road, and it's got to happen. This is where we can say, look, you are now seeing low traffic streets to the public. You need to fight for this to stay the way it is with air quality and playing out and all those things.
Yeah, that's great. I really like the let's not go back. It normally has to be 3 words, but I think we can permit an extra word here for a campaign.
I'm with Sustrans, and one of my the things I've really been noticing is the high streets. And in terms of thinking about allies, there's been, I'd be interested in hearing more about what the shopping streets has been doing. But I think anything around vibrant high streets, there's a lot of business improvement districts and other business support organizations that are looking for ways to kind of put out positive messages. I think they would be really good allies to talk about issues queuing, talking about the fact that there's not enough space at the moment for people in high streets. And I think that actually they're probably a group that might get listened to a bit more readily in government than I think we might. So reaching out to those allies, both at a local level in terms of advocacy, but also nationally, I think would be really important.
I mean, I'm not kind of attacking individual councillors or officers or anything. I don't do that. I was just talking about the problems, and the problems are really the problems we have at the very top level, at the level of government. And you've got that sort of lack of push from Heaton Harris, whereas we've also got Grant Shapps saying, you know, I must be the first transport minister ever to welcome fewer cars around. We've had the head of the AA, who I don't get on well with, saying maybe we don't need to spend £27 billion on new roads. So there's good stuff. And, you know, just as one thing to refresh ourselves, those of you who are Londoners, and it probably applies in other cities as well, do go for a bike ride in the centre of the city on a Sunday. It is bloody fantastic. It really will boost your spirits. I mean, the only problem is that there are a lot of newbie cyclists around who aren't quite very good at staying upright, and you might bump into one. But apart from that, it's fantastic. I'm not getting into that. And you know, the whole thing about being hopeful or despairing. I mean, we've been doing this about climate change. We just have to crack on. And I'm saying we should be aware of where the problems exist. And they are, you know, how we push for it, I don't know. As I said last week, if you're doing DIY stuff, do socially distance. Personally, I'm not into a kind of critical mass thing, but we have to be thinking about what happens if we don't get a very positive announcement from Will Norman this week. We have to be thinking about the fact that, you know, it's not going as well as we really want it to be. So that's all I'm saying, but I hope I'll have better news on my posts and when I see you again next week.
Well, a week's a long time, isn't it? And I'll just say for everybody, I'm still a newbie cyclist to Bob. I've only been doing it for 40 years and I'm still learning my trade in there, so don't get too worried. Has anybody else got any other observations? I will start winding it down now because I don't want to overload people.
Can I just say something? Schultz said something really positive, which is that we need to be recording people with vox pops in the interviews. My friend Katie's doing a master's with Rachel Aldred at the moment, and they've had to redefine what they do for their dissertations because apparently they're not allowed to do any field work. Even if they're allowed to cycle, they're not allowed to appear to be cycling. So she's contacting parents who have been on Twitter saying it's wonderful to cycle now, and is trying to get them to record their own family's experiences and using that as her master's dissertation. And I think that should go for everybody. We need to be doing positive stuff, positive stories of people who are absolutely, completely and utterly not cyclists happening to cycle. They don't think of themselves, they never will think of themselves as cyclists. They just happen to be getting on a bike for this time, and maybe they'll get on a bike more. And we must expunge the word cyclist from anything we say, and we must expunge pedestrian as far as possible as well. And it should be all about people who choose to use a certain mode at a certain time, and none of us should be using cyclist.
I've been working on a Sport England project recently, and they were really keen on the idea of different ways of evaluating stuff and using videos and vox pops as part of that, capturing the emotion and the energy. And it doesn't take very long, and I think it could be really powerful.
Well, there's quite a few good vox pops tonight, so I will be taking this. I'll do a few edits in case anybody said anything too mad, but we've been a lot better than last week. So there will be vox pops out there. The all-party parliamentary group for cycling have been following it, so I'm hoping there's some influential people watching this.
Well, I hope the APPCWGW are taking note, because it is vital. I mean, Bushy Park is full of little tots aged 3 and 4 cycling as if their lives depended on it. It's gorgeous to see.
Well, I think it's one, I normally never say cyclist, and despite being LCC, try and avoid the word whenever I can, but actually we're seeing, there's a couple of bogeymen in as, to be a bit negative like Bob. Sports cyclists in London are being attacked by the national media like on a daily basis now. And so I think actually we should really be aware of the fact that there is a real risk to all of us cycling, all the kids cycling, from shutting parks, from the pressure from the media on this one. And I think we have to be really clear and stand shoulder to shoulder with folks in weird lycra shorts, and be very clear that they're not actually behaving badly, and that 20 miles on a bike isn't incredibly far to ride, and you can do well within, you could do well within your kind of allotted exercising time, things like that. So I think it's really important that we don't lose the word cyclist at the moment in all this. That's all I have to say.
I agree with you. It's still a common use word, and everybody knows what you're talking about. It depends whether you're writing a policy paper for local government or you're talking to someone. Yeah, you're going to go out and ride a bike. You're going to be a cyclist, and then it's all good, isn't it? And I personally, to get in a lycra one, I've never had a problem with lycra. Well, it looks very comfortable, and as I'm approaching my lycra wearing years now, another couple of years and another couple of pounds, I'll be perfect for that gear on there. Has anybody got any? I'm bringing in the ideas with Beer's philosophy that people say really important ideological stuff, and then I say a stupid joke about it.
Which is somebody said about TROs and things. Just I think watch the Cycling UK space is all I can say.
The positive things is there's nothing like seeing a 3-year-old in the family cycling around St Paul's. Do say thank you to people. You're all on social media. When the police are doing controls on speeding and stuff like that, they get a lot of flack from people. Get in there and just say thank you. And I would think that when stuff, as we hope it does come through, done by local authorities, let the chief execs and the politicians and officers say thank you, this is good. This is the kind of stuff we want to see. Always make it clear that we didn't want this to happen. This isn't the way to get the right kind of highway environment and modal share. Just say, there's good stuff happening. We want more of it. Thanks very much.